Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's Pasture Project webinar. My name is Pete Huff. I'm the Program Officer at the Wallace Center at Windrock International, and I'm responsible for looking after the Pasture Project. So I wanted to welcome you and thank you for tuning in tonight for what will be a great webinar on an emerging-ish topic and area of interest in which a lot of folks are curious. So hopefully tonight's webinar will help provide some much needed information about grazing cover crops and the planning and the infrastructure considerations that need to be taken into account when looking at integrating this on your farm, ranch, or other land you may manage and operate. So I have the honor to introduce our speaker for this evening. Kent Solberg is the Livestock and Grazing Specialist for the Sustainable Farming Association. Beyond working as a specialist for SFA, he also owns and operates an award-winning grass-based livestock farm in west central Minnesota with his wife, Linda. He's got over 25 years in planned grazing and livestock, pasture livestock systems. And for the last 10 years, he's had a heavy focus on cover crops and seeded annuals to integrate livestock with cropping systems and soil health. Kent is a tireless presenter and teacher and instructor. He focuses on topics around organic transitions, forages, cover crops, fencing, grazing, livestock, and soil health. You may have seen Kent on some of the Pasture Project videos on watering and fencing systems. He's also coordinator for the Minnesota Dairy Initiative, master grazer for the Dairy Grazing Apprenticeship, and all around a tireless advocate for farmers in grazing throughout the upper Midwest. And Kent is going to run us through grazing cover crop planning and infrastructure. So with that, I will stop talking and hand over control to you, Ken.
Well, good evening. Thank you, Pete. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I want to spend a little time tonight talking about planning and infrastructure in relation to grazing cover crops. I'm glad to see there's lots of livestock and other folks on here. Hopefully, you'll have plenty of things to take away with you tonight. So in planning for using cover crops, I think we first need to think through how do we want to use those cover crops with livestock. Are we looking to extend our grazing season? Are we looking to extend perennial pasture rest during the summer period or addressing that summer slump? Is it something we want to use for calving or lambing pasture, particularly in the spring to avoid mud, maybe disease issues? How about weaning pasture, another great option and opportunity? Or are we grazing high performance animals such as stock or dairy animals? One of the beauties of grazing cover crops is it gives us the opportunity to address a host of other resource concerns. This can be everything from increasing crop diversity, preventing erosion, building soil aggregate structure, improving water infiltration, reducing compaction. Maybe it's part of an integrated pest management plan to break weed or insect pest cycles. Building soil organic matter, absolutely fabulous opportunity. We hear reports of folks even bumping soil organic matters 1 percentile in 1 year by grazing complex covers. Promotion and nutrient cycling, encouraging pollinators and beneficial insects, adjusting our carbon nitrogen ratios in the soil, providing food and shelter for wildlife could be something else. And there may be other resource concerns you want to address. There's just a vast array of other opportunities other than feeding our livestock we can accomplish. We'll talk more about that as we go, but it's something certainly to think about taking advantage of. So some basic things on planting our cover crop. First, soil type. What are we dealing with soil type? Certain cover crops work better in different soil types. For example, pearl millet tends to work better in sandy soils, where sorghum Sudan grass may work better in a clay silt loam soil. Fertility. I've seen fertility tests on low fertility soils that are extremely low. And if we want enough tonnage out there, enough volume out there to feed our livestock, to create biomass, to work towards soil health, we may need to provide some fertility in order to do that. And we want to do that based on a soil test. How does the cover crop fit into our crop rotation? What was our previous crop? What's our subsequent crop? If our previous crop has been a long history of grass legume hayfield, and we want to renovate that, maybe we want to think about integrating warm season grasses and broadleaves into that rotation. If our subsequent crop's going to be something like corn or sunflowers, we probably want to leave those out as potential cover crop options in our planning. What's the herbicide history? Pete talked about having some supplements today, some resources that are available to you on herbicide history, and we'll talk more about that. Definitely something to think about in the planning process, not only for the ability of that cover crop to successfully grow and germinate, but maybe some restrictions on forage and grazing use. What's our target planting date for planting this cover crop in? How many growing degree days are we going to have left in the season? This can be particularly important in the north with such a short growing season, and we'll talk more about that here in a little bit and give you a resource to reference for your particular area. Is irrigation available for this field? That takes some of the risk out of establishing the cover crop. What type of planting equipment are we using? Are we using a drill, broadcast, air seeder? What are we using? What type of drill are we using? Is it a press drill? Is it a no-till drill? How many seed boxes are on that drill? Do we have just one seed box we're working with? Then we probably want to think about not, and we're using a multi-species cover crop, we probably want to think about not filling that drill box more than 1/3 full to minimize sifting. Yes, it means filling that box more often, but we do minimize sifting. If we have 2 boxes or three boxes, and we're using a complex cover crop mix, we can adjust our mix accordingly. Small seed in one box, large seed in another. One thing we've found out over the years is that seeds like sorghum Sudan, they're very round and they tend to flow very rapidly in that drill. And if you've got the option of 3 seed boxes, you may want that sorghum Sudan separate from other things that are out there. Broadcast seeding. Are we doing ground broadcast? Are we doing aerial seeding? Knowing what works and what doesn't. Oats tends not to broadcast seed from an airplane or a helicopter real well, where annual ryegrass tends to work quite a bit better. What labor do you have available at the time of year do you want to do this? Would it be beneficial to contract this out and have a contractor do the seeding for you? What's your termination plan? How are you going to terminate this cover crop? And we'll talk more about some specifics about that, but very important if it's part of a bigger crop rotation. Do you need to be concerned about maintaining your organic certification or grass-fed certification or other certifications that are involved with your farm? Many of you who are direct marketing or in the organic world will understand and appreciate the need for being aware of that as you're putting your plan together. You know, all these things basically add up to is we're treating this cover crop like a crop, like any other crop. So it takes some thought, consideration to do it. It's just a little different, some different things we have to consider than if we're planting wheat or sunflowers or soybeans or something like that. But we do want to treat it like a crop if we want to plan for success. Resources that are available to you. The Midwest Cover Crop Council has a website. This is essentially like an online encyclopedia of cover crops. Most of us are involved in some sort of row crop situation, so we can go to that. We can select where we're at. We'll just pick Iowa here. We can select our county, and what we're going to get is a bar chart down below that's showing potential planting dates for these cover crops. So if you're coming in late in the season and doing some planting, what are our options? And that's these green bars give us the most reliable establishment opportunity here. The yellow bars showing risk to freeze. If we go in and select our goals, we're talking about grazing tonight. So grazing would be our first goal, and we can pick other goals. We talked about many other things. Maybe it's to minimize erosion. We get a ranking over here, scale of 1 to 4, or 0, to 4 for each of these. One thing nice about this, in addition to giving us potential planting dates for our cover crops and knowing what may or may not work for us, and by no means is everything on here, but if we don't know our annual rye from our winter rye, we can hover over here, click on this, and it'll bring up a fact sheet. I'm not going to do that in the interest of time tonight. That's something you can do on your own. but you can click on that fact sheet and get quite a bit of information and learn more about that particular cover crop if it's not something you're familiar with or used to. We talked about herbicide restrictions. There are some herbicides that have label restrictions for forage and grazing. Some of these cheat sheets that are available as resources for you tonight, either from Practical Farmers of Iowa or University of Wisconsin Extension, go through some of the most common herbicides out there and what the restrictions might be based upon your subsequent forage crop. By no means is every herbicide out there on these lists, but it's a great way to start with some of the more common ones. The label is the law. And so if there's not something listed on here that was utilized on that field in the past few years, I'd encourage you to go back to the label and double check. I do want to flag that some of the longest persistence in herbicides are on some of the soybean pre-emergent herbicides. So watch those really carefully. I mean, watch them all carefully, but watch those most carefully. There are some herbicides out there that have withdrawal periods for forages or grazing out to 40 months. So that means if you're looking at implementing covers in a corn and soybean field, you probably want to look back the herbicide history the last 4 seasons just to be safe. Again, those resources are available to you tonight. Pete's got them listed for your information. Putting together complex cover crop mixes. We talked about this a little bit in the last webinar. Green Cover Seed has a tool that's available online. It's free to use. It's called the Smart Mix Calculator. You do not need to sign in or buy anything for them. There's no obligation. You can just go in as a guest. So here's a new mix. Acres to plant. We'll just run through this. 40 acres. We're going to skip that. We'll use the zip code there just in the interest of time. We do have to pick a bagging option. We're going to assume we're going to drill this. You do have to choose the next cash crop. We'll just say it's going to be corn. We're pretty ambitious folks, so we're going to try and get that in the ground this week. I like to pick a termination date on or around when we don't run into problems for RMA, for crop insurance, if we're dealing with that. So I'll usually just pick November 1st. That works for a lot of people, particularly in the upper Midwest, but check with your crop insurance advisor on if there's going to be some issues there. And then we need to pick 3 goals. Obviously tonight we're talking about grazing cover crops, so we're going to pick that as our primary goal. Second priority, let's just pick another one. We talk about opportunities to address other resource issues with these cover crops and grazing. So let's take advantage of that and build that into our mix here. So then we get our calculator here. We want this Smart Mix Auto Adjust on for now. This takes a lot of the work out of it for us. They will present recommendations for us based on their knowledge and experience. You may have some slightly different experiences in your areas, but it's a great place to start. Our 3 goals are identified here on the top. Now we can just begin by adding some species. The easiest thing to do, these are ranked from the highest, excellent category, from the highest to the lowest. If you remember from our last conversation on the other webinar, we like to see a minimum of 3 legumes, 3 grasses, and 3 broadleaves in our rotation, or in our mix, excuse me. Now, let's just say, for example, we pick corn as our next crop. So we could choose something like sunflower here to be part of this mix. And it's going to go ahead and build that mix for us. And if we look at the top here, it gives us how we did as far as achieving our 3 goals. We achieved 100% of our goal according to their experience and recommendations, on supplemental grazing, 90% on erosion reduction, and 90% on weed suppression. We're never probably going to see 100% on our secondary and tertiary goals. Usually if we're in the 90th percentile on our primary, in the 80th percentile or better on our secondary, and 70th percentile on our tertiary, we're probably in the ballpark. One of the things, because we're looking at grazing here, I encourage you to go down to the bottom, and it talks about this full rate. The Smart Mix calculator is set at a default of around 125% of full rate. Typically when we're grazing, a lot of people will shoot for that 140 to 150% full rate. So what we can do is go back up here and shift off the Smart Mix calculator. That allows us to go in and adjust our rates here in this column in pounds per acre. Usually what I do is we want tonnage out there, we want feed, and I'll go down to my grass species, and that's where I'll add. If money's tight and I'm concerned about a budget, I'll look at what's cheapest in cents per pound here. Now these are their prices, these aren't universal prices, but we can up this and put another rate in here. It'll recalculate for us. So we upped our rate £1.50 an acre, got us up to 132. Well, what's the next cheapest thing? Well, this other sorghum Sudan's a little bit cheaper. Let's go to 4.5 pounds an acre and gets us to 136, nowhere near enough. So let's go to 6. There we go, we're at 142. Now we're in the ballpark of something more along the lines of what we might want for forage production. Again, we're still at 100% for meeting our primary goal and in the 90th percentile for our secondary and tertiary goal. We can click this box out here, and based on their prices, we can get a relative cost per acre for seed. So it gives you an idea, a ballpark figure of what you might be looking for putting your mix together. Great little tool. Encourage you to go in and play around with that, and you can sign in as a guest or just click in and away you go with that. When you get your mix, I strongly encourage you to calibrate your drill. This is a link to a YouTube video from the Nobles Foundation. It's about 7-8 minutes long. It's very informative. It kind of gives you the universal information on calibrating your drill, but it's something you really need to do. A lot of drills have a chart inside for wheat, for oats, for field peas, for grass seed, whatever. That'll get you in the ballpark to start, but don't depend on that on these cover crop mixes. There's usually too much variability there. You do need to spend a little bit of time calibrating your drill. If you don't want to watch the video, check out your owner's manual or the manufacturer's website for specific information on your make and model of drill. I do want to make you aware of single versus multi-cut cover crop species. Single cut or single graze means they're probably not going to regrow after they've been cut or grazed. Corn and sorghum are examples of this, but there's a lot of examples of multi-cut species out there. The millets, the Sudan grass, sorghum Sudan, a number of the brassicas, cowpea, are all examples of multi-cut species. So if you want to graze this, say midsummer, and then again later in the fall, if your growing season allows for that, weather conditions allows for that, something to keep in mind versus something you may only want to graze once. Cover crop termination, something very important to think about, particularly in a crop rotation situation. The easiest for most kill, and one of the beautiful things we have in the North Country, is that we can use winter to do the job for us. It depends on the cover crop, but we get into northern Wisconsin, North Dakota, northern Minnesota, into the Canadian provinces. We can just about always count on most cover crops other than, say, cereal rye, being terminated by winter kill, and even sometimes that is. So it's a great way to go. If you're a beginner in the North Country, pick those things that will terminate for you. It makes it really easy. Herbicide's another option for you. For a lot of row crop people, it fits right into your regular herbicide program anyway, so it's not a huge deal. Roller crimping. There's been some great work done. University of Wisconsin-Madison, Erin Silva and her team there have some great information available on roller crimping cereal rye and terminating that before a crop. There's also some good information out of Indiana, Jasper County, Indiana on that, and there's some good YouTube videos on that. Tillage may be another option. If you're organic, you may have to do this. Herbicides kind of off the table in that particular situation. We can do it with grazing. I've done it with grazing. We do need high enough stock densities. The timings of plant maturity is very similar to using a roller crimper, but we need that high stock density. And the challenge is often having enough animals and enough time during that narrow window of opportunity to crimp over, to trample over those stalks and break those stems to terminate that and do it. We can terminate or also set back some crops by very intensive grazing to actually hurt those plants, but oftentimes when we're talking about full-blown termination, we want to break those stalks over. We need the high stock density to do that. We need enough animals. It works on a relatively small area, not on a huge area if you have enough animals. So something to keep in mind there. It can be done with intensive severe grazing to the plant to suppress it in order to integrate another cover crop. That's a little bit different deal. So let's talk about some of the different variances and some things to consider when seeding cover crops. Interseeding covers into row crop. Great way to turn that corn stover into a much more balanced ration for livestock. It is something that's much easier for our friends in the southern and eastern corn belt to do than our folks in the northern and western corn belt. You've got more reliable range. You typically have more rain than we do. You typically have a longer growing season than we do. It makes it work. Regardless of where we are, though, there are some reasons for failure that we've seen out there. One of the big ones is herbicide carryover. The plants just can't survive, particularly when we're dealing with pre-emergence. If we haven't had enough rain to work that herbicide through the system, there can be problems there. Lack of timely moisture is a big one. We've seen where the cover crops germinated and then no moisture on top of it, and it's those poor little plants just die. Or we don't even get enough moisture for germination in some of our western areas. Poor seed to soil contact is another reason. If we're dealing with soils that have very poor aggregate structure, there's crusting on the surface of the soil, this is really difficult. And so we may have to compensate for that. And then just corn canopy shading. One of the reasons we shoot for full canopy coverage on corn is to prevent competing plants or weeds from coming up underneath. And that can be highly successful even to the point of not allowing our cover crops to work very well. There's things we can do to minimize the risk. Again, watch pre-emergent herbicides. The cover crops are typically planted at V5 to V7. There are people experimenting at V3. We've seen very good success with an inter-row no-till drill. This is typically a no-till drill that's been modified to plant 2 or 3 rows of cover crops in between, say, a 30-inch corn row planting to ensure good seed-to-soil contact. And Farmer Innovation is really leading the charge there. Think about shorter stature corn or shorter height corn to allow more sunlight to penetrate that corn canopy. The jury seems to be still out on leaf architecture on corn. There's some data that suggests that vertical leaf architecture can allow more sunlight into the ground than horizontal leaf architecture. I've seen mixed data on that. I think there's some more things to tweak out, but it's something to watch for the future. Short day corn. Oftentimes we see cover crops establish, but then they just aren't getting enough sunlight, particularly in late July and August, in order to carry them through until that corn plant starts to dry down and allow more light through. Think about shorter day corn. At current commodity prices, we've got producers out there who are finding that corn's just kind of filling the gaps during the growing season, and they've gone to a shorter day corn. With some of the newer hybrids, we don't see near the yield drag that we've seen historically in the past, and they're finding that by getting cover crops out in those fields, by using shorter day corn to create that opportunity, they're actually netting more per acre off grazing those cover crops than they ever are on those cornfields at current commodity prices. Watching that plant population. 32,000 seems to be kind of a cutoff. We're seeing time in and time out. There are some varieties where the maximum plant population is 31 or 32,000. So think about that. We're also seeing some data out of South Dakota State indicating that as soil health improves, we can cut back plant population from 36 even down to as low as 24,000 plants per acre. And if we've got good solid soil health, we're not seeing any reduction in yield out there. There are some other experiments going on out there. I'm not going to dive into those today because they're still kind of in process and we're evaluating those different row spacings and things like that. Those may create some opportunities for us in the future. So stay tuned for those. A lot of farmer innovation going on here, a lot of things being worked out, a lot of work in this area to see if we can make this work because there's a lot of interest there. Cover crops after small grains, pulse or canning crops. Great opportunity. Those are typically beginning to come in the southern states. They're already off the fields. There's a lot of growing season left. In the northern states, these are just coming off fields right now. We still have plenty of growing degree days out there to do some things. So think about that. Depending on your latitude, depending on the time of year we're at, think about how many growing days you do have left when you're planting that cover crop. One of the best opportunities out there that's kind of universal is oats, particularly in the Midwest. Fairly cheap seed. We get some of our best tonnages in the fall. We can plant it just about any time of the year. Obviously, we wouldn't want to follow an oat cover crop, but if we're following field peas, if we're following spring wheat, if we're following barley, something like that, if we're following sweet corn, oats can be a great opportunity, cheap, readily available, easy to get in, probably the best opportunity for tonnage. Then we can mix other things in there for grazing. We can look at some of the clovers, lentils, winter pea, depending on what else we had out there, and a lot of the brassicas fit well into a mix with oats into the fall. Annual pasture to manage for the summer slump. This would be part of a much broader and bigger rotation. Again, because of low commodity prices out there, we've got producers that are finding that this is probably a more profitable venture. Now, does this mean we need to do it on every acre? No, most people were probably looking at 5 to 20, maybe up to 25% of the row crop acres for this, depending on how many cattle you have to feed, depending on other circumstances involved with your farm. But this could be an opportunity that during low commodity prices, if you've got a dairy replacement heifers to feed, if you've got stockers to feed, if you want to do some custom grazing of somebody else's animals, this may be an opportunity to look at with these continued low commodity prices as a way to make some money on that ground and actually build soil health and maybe even reduce input costs for some of your future row crops. Double cropping. Something very common in the south, not something we're real familiar with in the north, but there are opportunities. Silage crops such as this oat, barley, peas, great way to go. Typically we can get this off in early to mid-June, and there's still plenty of growing season to do something else. So just creating those opportunities and things to think about in planning. Hayfield or pasture renovation, we talked about this in our last webinar. I'd like to point out here that take that first crop off. This should be one, if you want to do this on this field, it should be one of the first hay crops or grazing paddocks that you hit in the spring, particularly in the north, so we can get the most number of growing degree days to have the most opportunity to grow as much biomass out there as possible. If it's, again, been in a cool season crop for years, we're going to want to look at warm season species like are in this picture here. to help build soil micropopulations, and we really see a downstream boost on hay and pasture production after something like this. We've had some great successes. Season extension grazing, some considerations, particularly for those of you in the North Country. Think about building species in the mix that are going to stay upright in a snowfall. What the animals do when there's been snow on here, and this has been documented up to 18, 20 plus inches of snow, is they'll start grazing on the plants, these stiffer plants like corn, sorghum, Sudan grass, millets. They'll start grazing on those and work their way down to some of the more cold tolerant species like some of the brassicas down in the understory. And they will find them versus everything getting flattened by an early ice storm or early wet heavy snow. So if you're thinking season extension grazing, one of the ways to take some risk out of it is build these more upright plants that the animals can easily find even in deep snow and work their way down to the other stuff. Let's switch gears now to infrastructure. I want to talk about that because we do need some infrastructure to make this happen. I want to touch on fencing first because this is really what makes this sing. We're going to focus mostly on energized fencing because that's the most widely adaptable for grazing cover crops. Not that you can't use woven or barbed wire or board fences. And hey, if that's already the great, all the more power to you. Even if you only have it on one or two sides of this field, hey, that's that much less you've got to worry about. You can just work right off of that. So we're going to focus on energized fences. And they can be extremely effective. Just a few examples here. Here's some dairy replacement heifers that have been grazing on this cover crop on the left. That's just a single strand of hot wire. But there's been some good management, some good planning, some good work into making this work. And it's very effective in keeping those animals off that neighboring cover crop. Here's an example. There's 193 pair in this particular field where this picture was taken, cow-calf pair. And for 51 days, they grazed about 400 acres of cover crops. And right here, that's the perimeter fence around that whole 450 acres. Now, these are animals that are trained to this fence. There was plenty of voltage on here. These animals never wanted for feed or water. It was a very well-managed system, and it worked extremely well. These single wire systems can be highly effective if managed, and that's just what I want to show you. You may or may not be comfortable with that. I'm not saying that's the only thing to go with. I'm just showing how effective well-managed energized fencing can be. So how does an energized fence work? The Energizer, a low impedance, high voltage Energizer, gives out a short duration pulse about every second. The duration of this pulse is about 3/10,000ths of a second, and that's for safety reasons. It's sending out the positive charge, the pulse over the wires, and then any animal or human standing on the ground contacts that wire, completes the circuit back through the ground, and receives that shock. And we want that shock to be memorable in order to be effective. One of the ways to help understand how to manage fencing is start to look at what are the things that cause failure. And if we understand what the potential for failure is, I think oftentimes it just helps us with our management. And these are some of the reasons livestock get out of fences. Gates left open. I can speak from experience. A couple weeks ago, a neighbor and I were working on a project. We were in and out of the pasture a few times. Gates were open. It was an evening project. We got sort of fixed on that, chatting about other things as we were working. Sundown came, the mosquitoes came out, we headed for the house, and guess what? We forgot to close the gate. Woke up next morning, and there the cattle were, happily grazing my lawn. So it can happen. But late gates being left open, it happens. That's a human error. That's not the fault of the fence. That's the fault of me, the manager. Fences being turned off. You're going to go do some work on the fence. Let's say a branch broke off a tree in a windstorm, fell on that. You need to go clear that off. You're going to shut the fence off in order to go work on it. And if you're like me or any other farmer, before you get back to turn the Energizer on, you think or see of 3 other things you need to do. You get busy with those. You get distracted. The fence doesn't get turned on. 3 days later, you get a knock on the door from the county sheriff saying, are those your cattle out on the road? Oh, yeah, I forgot to turn the fence back on. Lack of maintenance, another reason. This is typically related to vegetation on the fence. It may be insulator failure, maybe a deer has run through the fence, knocking insulators off, and the fence is shorting out, whatever. It's creating low voltage. It's been that way for a few days. Animals put some pressure on the fence, don't get a shock, poof, they're through. Animals not being trained to an energized fence. This can be a really big one. Working with a producer here a couple weeks ago, and they got a little antsy about getting their animals out on some pasture, put some new fence in. They had been advised to spend a day or two training their animals to a fence. Got a little antsy, got late in the evening and said, let's just turn them out. They turned them out. Well, at midnight in a thunderstorm, they were still out there chasing their animals, trying to get them back in. Animals got a little rambunctious, didn't know where their boundaries were, weren't used to that fencing, poof, off they go. They didn't take the time to train their animals. Wire spacing does not match your class of animals. We'll talk more about that as we go. Animals hungry. I think we've all driven down the road, seen the 4-strand barbed wire fence that's pushed out towards the road ditch because there's nothing for those animals to eat on their side of the fence. And so they're straining to reach through, and sometimes they actually squirt through. And they're in the road ditch or on the road because that's where the food is. That's a management issue. Fences not being visible in vegetation. One of the challenges in some of these cover crop scenarios is that we have cover crops that are 4 or 5, even 6 feet tall, 7 feet tall when we get animals in there. We need to clear a path. We need to make that fencing visible. White polywire, white poly tape is a great way to help do that. But if it's just cutting through vegetation and they can't see it before they bumble into it, we're going to have trouble. Again, human error, our management, our lack of management, our failure to do the management is the primary cause of animals getting out. Other reasons why animals get out: being chased by a predator, neighborhood dogs. I've seen steers go through 4-strand barbed wire. Has nothing to do with the number of wires. They're chased. And really, if our goal is to 100% stop that, we're probably looking at a 12-foot high concrete wall. And you're going, Kent, that's utterly ridiculous. Yes, it is. But the point being is if we want to stop all animal escapes, we need to probably do something that's not practical or realistic. Subordinate animals being pushed through a fence. This often happens in interior fences. Occasionally it happens at a gate and they break the gate or they get pushed through wire. I've seen the young animals get forced through even multi-wire barbed wire fence. It does happen sometime, but usually once they realize they're not being harassed and there's something to eat, they don't go very far. And then we have our fence jumpers. Those that want to go. Oftentimes this is associated with breeding behavior. I had a bull one time. Neighbor wanted to borrow him. We took him over there. He had 4-strand barbed wire fence. Over the fence he went to go visit the neighbor's cows. He didn't stick around very long. And that is our best management choice oftentimes when we do have a fence jumper. Yes, it's hard to do if it's a prize animal, an animal that's doing well for us, but if we don't take action in this case, they tend to teach their friends, and pretty soon the whole herd or flock is heading over the fence. So typically getting rid of them is the best solution. So some basics. Energized fencing is a psychological barrier. It's not a physical barrier. It's the shocking power of the fence that deters the animal. That means we need to have adequate voltage on that fence. I like to see 7,000 volts on a brand new clean fence. So if you're putting up a new fence around a cover crop field, you should see 7,000 volts. And as we talked about, training your animals before they go out in that field is critical. Wire spacing and the number of wires is very important. We want to base that on the class of animal we're dealing with, but also on your personal comfort level. Now, I showed you some examples of where single wires were very effective. You may not be comfortable with that, and that's perfectly fine. Put up the number of wires that you're going to be able to go to sleep at night and be comfortable with. I do want to encourage you to avoid steel T-posts if you have some concerns here. We have insulator failure because a branch falls on it, the deer run through it. I've even seen bird poop accumulate and create a dead short through the insulator from the wire to the steel T-post because there wasn't rain for a long period of time to wash that bird manure off. And there was a dead short on the fence through the bird poop because there were dozens of posts that had accumulated bird poop between the wire and the steel T-post. So things to watch for, things to stay away from, and things to plan for. Grounding. For most of us, we're doing a several acres, 20, 30, 40, 60, maybe 160, maybe 400 acres of cover crops. Minimum of 3 ground rods. If we have a very small area we're doing, say less than an acre or two, yeah, we might be able to get by with 1, depending on soil conditions. But typically we're looking at a minimum of 3 ground rods. I recommend 6-foot galvanized steel ground rods versus copper. Copper can corrode over time due to soil chemistry. You don't know until it happens, and then it's a problem. It's too late. The ground rod should be a minimum of 10 feet apart and at least 66 feet away from any other ground rods, such as with your electrical system and any wells. One of the things to remember about energized fence materials is, in general, you get what you pay for. So pay attention to that. Energizers should be determined by the number of acres to fence, the class of animal. Is it a clean fence or does it have vegetative load on it? If we're fencing covers, oftentimes it's a clean fence anyway versus something that's out there all season and can accumulate a vegetative load. Also the number of wires will determine that. Plug-in units versus battery. Plug-in's going to be the most reliable, but oftentimes these cover crop sites are not anywhere we can plug an Energizer in. Then we're looking at a battery. People often ask, Kent, well, how about a solar unit? All the solar panel is a trickle charger to recharge the battery. Great in the summertime, great option. Oftentimes, though, it's cheaper to buy a second battery, rotate those batteries out every couple of weeks than it is to buy a solar panel and a controller and all the equipment to set that up. Not that it can't work, just think it through carefully. One of the problems we run in Michigan and North Dakota and Minnesota and Wisconsin and the Canadian provinces in the winter, particularly in November and December when we're out grazing some of these covers, is we don't get a lot of solar activity or insolation, as it's called, during the day to really recharge that battery. So we're better off being on a recharge schedule every week or 10 days during that period of time. A number of manufacturers have charts to size your Energizer. I'd encourage you to refer to those and look at the realistic piece. A lot of times Energizers will say, our fencer powers up to 100 miles of fence. Actually, what they mean is it powers up to 100 miles of wire. And what it means is at 100 miles, we probably won't read any voltage on that fence anymore. Well, we talked about a minimum volt, or we talked about a recommended voltage of 7,000 volts on the fence, particularly for training new animals. We run out 100 miles, there's no more voltage on that fence. That doesn't do us a whole lot of good. So be a little cautious about that. If the chart says this should be good with a vegetative load up to 40 or 50 or 120 acres or whatever, you may want to round up to the other level, particularly if it's going to be out there all season. If it's going to be a nice, clean cover crop field, that may not be as important, and you might be able to get by with just the standard recommendation. Here's a tool I'd encourage you to include in your Energized Fence toolkit, and that's a digital voltmeter with a fault finder. Most people who get these say that the fault finder, the extra cost to have the fault finder pays for itself usually in the first season. It saves a lot of running around looking for hard to find shorts if you get into problems. This picture here is showing an amp draw of 7.0 amps, and the arrow's pointing in the direction of where that amp draw is. Very, very handy if you have a lot of fence out there. Most of our cover crop grazing is occurring with cattle, and it's usually with larger cattle or cattle with large calves at side, over 300, 350 pounds. And a lot of producers are looking for an option on, I don't want to fence the whole farm in. I'm only grazing 5 or 10% of the farm with covers a year. We're moving it around. What can I do? Well, here's an option we've had some success with, and I just pointed out as an option. You may want to adjust it to your particular needs, but it's basically a 2-wire high tensile fence. It's using the 14 gauge high tensile wire instead of the standard 12.5. The higher the gauge, the smaller diameter of wire, so the 14 gauge is a little lighter. We compromise just a little bit on durability on this fence, but not a lot, and we save a lot of weight. That makes it much easier to put this fence up and pull it down. It's a 2-wire design. Our end and corners are just 6-inch diameter posts at 48 inches in the ground. These tube type insulators are nice because they're easy to go on, easy to go off. Our line posts are a 7/8 by 5 foot 7/8 diameter by 5 foot long solid fiberglass post. These are typically placed every 30 to 50 feet, with 40 being the average. Very easy to go in, very easy to take out, no reason for shorting. Gate and corner posts can be set, and unless they're going to interfere with field operations for subsequent row crops, a lot of producers will leave these in. Typically in corner situations, they're out of the way because you're turning a corner here and there's often enough space there in order to leave that. These posts and these wires are easy to pull up. We can recover over 99% of the materials on one of these fences, and it just makes a really nice option. 2 guys, you have all your ducks in a row and everything lined up, can usually go out and do a square 40-acre piece in about a day on this, so it's not a lot of work. I've done this myself. 2 of us have pulled down 50 acres of this. It was an odd-shaped piece. There were 8 corners. 2 of us pulled one of these fences down in about 5 hours. Pretty easy to do. If you're looking at more wires, you're going to have to look at a more substantial bracing system, or if you want to go to barbed or whole high tensile wire, typically looking at an H brace or a New Zealand diagonal brace, or something like this fiberglass system. It's called the Mule. This can be used in a semi-permanent situation. It's based on augers that go in the ground here and here. These can be screwed in or screwed out, either manually or mechanically. Pretty nice system, a little bit more expensive than a treated wood post, but it is an option to be aware of. I would encourage you to use springs and strainers. This is like a torque wrench if you're doing mechanic work. It's about getting the right tension on there, not to over tension the system, but to make sure there's enough tension on there for the fence to work. If we're working with small ruminants, most people find the fencing of choice is going to be this multi-wire energized netting. Most people who use this like the rigid vertical struts. This comes in a variety of lengths from usually 82 or 164 feet, depending on the manufacturer. You're going to be dealing with multi-wires for small ruminants anyway. There are people successfully doing it with 2 or 3 wires. And if you can do that, all the more power to you. But for most people, they find this netting works great because it also provides some degree of predator protection. They also have the electric netting available for poultry if you'd like to get them out on covers. And then hogs. Hogs and cattle are 2 of the easiest animals out there to control or manage with energized fencing. This is a 2-wire fence. It's actually really hard to see the 2 wires here. All these animals were born behind energized fence. This is a very cheap fence. It's just aluminum wire and fiberglass posts with a couple clips on here. Posts are about 10 to 15 apart, 10 to 15 feet apart here. The fiberglass, the solid fiberglass posts are used for corners. Once your animals are trained, hogs are trained to something like this, if you can get them on a trailer, there's really not anywhere you can't take these animals. Very, very effective for hogs and can certainly be used on a cover crop situation. Visibility is very important. So again, we're going to want to mash down a path so that the hogs come through, hit an opening before they run into that wire and can see it. Some safety tips on energized fencing. I encourage you, and most manufacturers encourage you never to energize barbed wire. There's a chance for entanglement there. Never use more than 1 energizer on a fence. I've seen people try to do this to boost power. Typically, you wreck both your fencers in the process here. Use only a UL listed or equivalent energizer on your fences. Use a lightning diverter. All that wire out there is like a humongous antenna. If you're fencing in, 40 or 160 or 320 acres of covers, if you got a $400 Energizer on there or $300 Energizer on there, a lightning diverter is a cheap insurance policy in case of lightning strike. Encourage you to wear safety glasses when working with high tensile wire. Supervise small children around energized fences. If you're along a public right-of-way or up against the edge of a town, a lot of fields are up against the edge of a town, I'd encourage you to use just simple warning signs. You can get stick-on ones for about 40 cents a piece. Use those. Let people know what you're going there, and they typically respect it. Do check with your local ordinances. Some townships have their own, some counties, some municipalities have their own ordinances for fences, particularly energized fences, so get familiar with that before you proceed. And I encourage you not to attach your energized fence to utility poles. The line crews will greatly appreciate that in a storm. So oftentimes I'm asked, okay, so can't we put up this perimeter fence with high tensile wire? But if I want to do any managed grazing, I'm going to be using Polywire. So I'd like to show you a few options on how to do that. This is one way to do it. We just get across our paddock or field, put a loop in the Polywire, tie it to a solid plastic handle that's completely insulated. And then we use these jumper leads to run power, which is already on the high tensile wire, over to the Polywire. Another option is a lot of these reels have a locking mechanism in them, so we can lock them and use the hooks that are provided on the reel to attach to the high tensile wire, and then use a jumper lead. Some of the reels are metal through here, and we don't need the jumper lead. If we lock it in place just through the hook, we can energize that. Here's another option that's out there. This is called a zammer. It's a handle that you can either have non-conductive or conductive here. Apologize, the picture got cut off. But we just make a loop in our Polywire, just like in the solid plastic handle, bring it around the conductive material here, and then thread it back through the slots here, just like a buckle on a backpack or a book bag or something like that. And then once we've done that, we just unhook it from the non-conductive hook to the conductive hook in order to energize our wire. There's lots of reel options out there, and this is by no means everything that's out there. It's just to give you an idea of what's out there, even including, yes, extension cord reels. There are people who like using those. It's a cheap option. They're not as durable as the commercial reels. If you're winding up long stretches of wire, you may want to consider a geared reel. Reels are kind of like buying a pair of shoes. You got to try them and find what you like, and you definitely get what you pay for. If we were to put all these out there, most people pick up the more expensive reel, like the quality and the feel of it, and tend to go that route. If you haven't had a chance to do that, typically we opt for the cheap ones. Unfortunately, oftentimes people are unhappy with those, and they want to, and they get discouraged with the whole process. Post options, lots of options. Cattle operators tend to use these ring top or pigtail posts. If you've got small stock involved or small ruminants, these multi-wire posts are the option, and these fiberglass posts are very handy for temporary corners, gates, and ends. A handy hack, if you will, to know is how to throw a clove hitch over these fiberglass posts. We're not going to watch this video now. It's not very long, but I'd encourage you to check this out and watch method 2 on how to throw a clove hitch. That's how we did this here with this close-up of the Polywire, and it's just a super handy thing to know. On frozen ground, things change. We have a couple options. One are these tumble wheels. These can be used year-round, but they work really slick in the winter. Or we can look at using something that can be driven in the ground, or something that just sits in the snow. And I've got a short little clip here, and that didn't come through. So we're going to jump ahead to about a minute 30 here, and we're going to see how, as it's loading, we're going to see how, in this particular operation, they just made a base that's welded on that they just throw down in the snow on frozen ground. Pretty simple, pretty straightforward, and easy to use. There are other people who go out with a concrete bit on a cordless drill and make that happen. It just depends on what you like. Lots of different options. I want to change gears here for water for the last few minutes here, because water is important. If you have a frost-free water, and there's many options as you see in the pictures here, great, use it. We have animals that are people that are walking their animals in the late fall and winter when their water requirements are lower, up to a mile and a half back in particular situations. In the summer, that's not a good idea, but in the winter in our northern areas, this certainly could be an option. And if you've got an automatic water, go for it, use it. There are also frost-free nose pumps that don't require electricity that can be set up in remote situations. Tire tanks with deep bury maybe an option. In the summertime, or when the ice isn't there, we can use managed access to surface water to keep that water clean. There are also solar pumping systems for remote application out there, sling and river pumps, windmill, portable nose pumps versus the stationary. Yes, even hauling water. And I've seen people haul water for literally hundreds of cattle. There's creative ways to do that. Rain catchment systems might work for you, or even a gravity or siphon system from ponds to some sort of tank with a float that can work. It can be as simple as a hydrant in the yard, and oftentimes this is all that's available. And with a simple tank and float, it can work just fine. In the wintertime, we can set up a continuous flow system by adding a wooden wedge and jimmying that float so it's only partially flowing. We can keep this freezing from well below sub-freezing temperatures. And I learned this from Canadians, and there's Canadians up there who do this routinely. We just hold that in place with a piece of tape, and it can continue to flow all the time. We do have to make sure that our overflow is going away from where the animals are, either tipping the tank or plumbing an option in there, but keeping that away from the animals so they don't have to deal with that ice. Works extremely well. I've used it myself into temperatures down to 15 below zero, as long as the power keeps running and the pump keeps running. And most people find that it's far cheaper to do this than it is to have an electric tank heater out there and running that tank heater. That becomes a very expensive proposition. You're hardly going to notice that extra pump work, just keeping continuous flow out there with just a small level of flow. For more information on watering systems, on fencing systems, I'd encourage you to go to the Pasture Project website. As Pete talked about, here's the link. Again, this whole webinar is going to be archived for information, so you can go back and look again if you didn't get that. And with that, Pete, I thank you, and we've got some time for some questions.
All right, thanks, Ken. I'll just take back control here. Thanks for that presentation. And as Kent mentioned, we are going to move into the question portion of the evening. So if you have some questions, now is a good time to start to enter those into the chat box, or into the question box. It's in the control panel. Again, on your control panel for the GoToWebinar, you should see a section in there for questions. Go ahead and enter those in. We do have some time now to send those out to Kent. As folks are typing in questions, we did have one that came in early on in the presentation, Kent, and I'll read it and see what you make out of it and see what comments you might have. The question is, in relation to fertility and fertilizer application, can you address what nitrogen rate needs to be, what the nitrogen rate needs to be in order to prevent toxicity?
Yeah, good question. Nitrate toxicity can be an issue, particularly in a drought situation. Maximum fertilizer rate on most of our cover crops, and that would be something that's going to put quite a bit of tonnage out there, all conditions being favorable to that, would be about 75 pounds an acre of actual nitrogen. Oftentimes we only see we need 30 to 50 pounds of actual N in order to create a very substantial cover crop. But great question to minimize toxicity. Typically we stay below 75. I'd encourage you to work off of a soil test before you do it. You may not need anything, but on a lot of our low fertility soils, particularly sandy soils, sometimes a little bump of nitrogen can go a long way to having a successful grazable cover crop.
Great. Thanks, Ken. Another question is stepping back to the cover crop calculator, the mix calculator that you shared, and thinking about multi-species cover crops, and also thinking about training. Is there a process by which you would train cattle to the herd to graze such a diverse multi-species mix? And is there maybe some recommendations on how to build up to greater diversity within a cover crop mix if you wanted to transition to get your cattle on there?
So for most people who are coming off, say, a rotational grazing type system, if they've been on pasture for a while, they're used to being moved, not much of a transition. If we've got a good balance of grasses, legumes, and broadleaves in there, if we don't force those animals to eat everything that's out there, if we try to adhere to the rule of take half, leave half, typically we don't see any problems. If for some reason it's a very lush cover crop, if it's heavy to brassicas, if it's got a lot of the cereal grains in the vegetative state, and it's going to be very lush, and they're coming off, say, native range that may be more lignified, we may want to transition by loading them up on some dry hay before we put them out there, and then leaving access to a free choice dry hay bale between the cover crop and wherever the water is. And as those animals come and go, they have an opportunity to balance that ration out. Great question, something we do want to keep in mind, but if we build in higher lignin type crops such as corn, millets, sorghum Sudan, if they have an opportunity to grow, particularly later in the season, if we don't force those animals to eat everything and we kind of follow our rule of threes, tends not to be a huge issue unless they're coming off very coarse feed. If they're coming off corn stalks and going into something like that and they're only eating corn stover, which they shouldn't, there should be something to balance that. Then we'd want a transition period probably with some dry hay. Make sure that's ruminants full. And that's just a good rule of thumb anyway as we're transitioning those animals. Fill them up on some good quality dry grass hay before we move them out there. Diversity is key in keeping problems down, and giving animals opportunity for choices goes a long way to minimizing problems.
Great. Thanks, Ken. A question here about, you mentioned briefly that in terms of water, and that for some folks hauling water might make the most sense, and some creative options for making that hauling make sense. And curious to share a little bit more about how folks in your experience have made that decision and how they might have been creative in order to overcome some of the downsides to that.
Yeah, great question. I hauled water for 6 seasons to a group of stocker animals that we did not have another water source for. We were going over there every day, checking those animals anyway, so it was easy to do. We just had a tank on a truck or a trailer, and we knew how long it took for that tank to fill when we threw the hose in there. And so we'd throw the tank in there and we'd set a timer. And in this day and age of smartphones, we were doing this in the day and age before smartphones, but in the day and age of smartphones, you can probably set an alarm. When you throw that hose in the tank, that alarm goes off and you can proceed to go off and do some other chores while that tank is filling. And then the alarm goes off, go back, shut it off, and then you go over and do your chores with those animals. Most people check them every day anyway. If we're doing any level of managed grazing, typically we're often moving them in a strip grazing situation on cover crops, moving them once a day. In cold weather, we had to drain that tank completely. I know some people who have access to a heated shop, they'll back that trailer or that truck in that heated shop to keep the valve from freezing. We knew really close how much water those animals would drink. So we would set up enough tanks. I'd like typically to see 2 to 4 inches of water left in the bottom of those tanks. We could still tip out whatever water was left. If it formed to ice by the time we filled it again, it wasn't a problem. When it was in freezing weather, we'd use a black tank. So when the sun came out by afternoon, typically it was thawing, grazing well into the fall, well into around Thanksgiving time in northern tier states. I have seen people use a 4,000-gallon tanker that they had access to haul water. And in fact, the slide where there was 193 pairs, that's how they watered. It was hauled in a tanker. They went in and set out a low gravity or a low flow system. There were 6 tires set up with floats in line in sequence there, and they just backed up that tanker to a quick coupler and hooked it up, opened the valve, and then it gravity fed into those 6 waters, and they brought water every 3 days. 3 or 4 days to those animals. I've seen other people hook up tanks in tandem I've seen people have gravity flow systems to a float, and the tanks are suspended on the side of a trailer, and it's just gravity to a float where those animals are watered for several days out there. I know people that have been grazing for years and never laid out poly pipe, and they do everything off of a tank system. So lots of creative ways to do it. In freezing weather, you have to get a little more creative, but typically we're not grazing all winter long and hauling water in those situations. We typically move to something else, and again, in very cold weather, animal water requirements are down. Oftentimes, if there's snow on the ground, loose snow, they'll lick snow instead of coming to water and can meet their water requirements, but they can walk, and sometimes we can make that shift then. So sometimes a combination of things gets us through that. Maybe we have to haul water early on and can walk them later as the ground freezes up, or harvest creates an opportunity to access that water. So I'd encourage you to get creative, look at all those different options and find what works best for you. We're not typically hauling water every day, all the time, every year. Oftentimes it's just for a few weeks or a month or two, and we just plan accordingly. If there's an opportunity there, we make it work because we're checking those animals anyway.
Great. Thanks, Ken. Another question here asking if you could briefly address sorghum in a mix and prussic acid.
Yeah, great question. Again, we're back to those choices. Typically, we run into issues with bloat, prussic acid, those sort of things often happen when we're have a single species or only one or two or three species in the mix, because that's all that's out there. And toxicity is usually related to quantity oftentimes. And so if we have our multi-species mix, 3 grasses, 3 legumes, 3 broadleaves, and we give those animals choices and we don't force them to eat everything, we literally have documentation of tens of thousands of cow days grazing those multi-species mix and not having an issue. I have watched my own cattle go into a field that was frosted 2 days before that had sorghum Sudan in the mix, along with multiple other species in the mix, watch them eat it, and nobody ended up with 4 legs up in the air. Time and time again, if it's a multi-species mix, if it's to the minimum recommended height, usually we're looking at around, we want about 30 inches out there of height before we start to graze it. If the animals have choices and we don't force them to eat everything, those problems just really kind of go away. The animal's allowed to pick and choose, balance their ration out, and avoid those toxicity problems.
Great. Thanks, Kent. Well, we are wrapping up for the evening, so we'll just take a few moments here to just close out the webinar. But first and foremost, wanted to say thank you to Kent Solberg from SFA for giving us quite a thorough run through of grazing cover crops and talking us through different fencing and water options. A lot of great content. So thank you, Kent. A lot of years of knowledge and experience all packed into one webinar. So really great presentation and also really great questions coming in from the audience. So wanted to say thank you to Kent. And before we move on and wrap up the webinar, just a few more comments. Just a quick reminder here that we do have that upcoming webinar on the economics of grazing cover crop with Megan Filbert from the Practical Farmers of Iowa. That's coming up next Monday, July 30th from 7 to 8:30 p.m. Central. Should be a really great webinar, and Megan has a lot of great knowledge to share and some really good tools to share as well in terms of matching up some of the economics with some of the practices that Kent was talking about today. With that, we'll say goodnight, and once again, thank you all.